Fluorescent lights buzzed like dying hornets over the cracked linoleum. A doctor's fragile ego had just crushed a woman's career before the morning coffee even went cold. She packed her locker, humiliated. Then heavy combat boots echoed down the sterile hallway, and a four-star general demanded to see her. Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital smelled like bleach, stale urine, and the burnt bottom of a coffee pot. It was an odor that burrowed into the pores, a scent Maggie Flynn could never scrub out no matter how hard she ran the loofah over her skin at the end of a 14-hour shift. Maggie leaned against the edge of the nurse's station, digging the heel of her hand into her lower back. A dull, throbbing ache had taken up permanent residence at the base of her spine. She was 34, but her joints felt 50. She wore faded navy scrubs that hung a little too loose around her shoulders, her hair pulled back into a messy, utilitarian knot held together by a cheap plastic clip. Trauma 1. 2 minutes out, the intercom crackled. Maggie didn't sigh. She didn't have the energy. She just pushed off the counter, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Dr. Arthur Pendleton arrived a minute later. He didn't walk. He glided. Pendleton was the chief of surgery, a man who treated his white coat like a tailored tuxedo. He smelled intensely of expensive vetiver and dry-clean starch, an offensive contrast to the raw, human odors of the emergency department. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand displaced by the chaos that usually surrounded him. He despised the ER. He viewed it as a noisy, disorganized waiting room for his pristine operating theater. "What do we have?" Pendleton asked, checking the face of his platinum watch. He didn't look at Maggie. He rarely looked at the nursing staff. To him, they were just organic extensions of the hospital's monitoring equipment. "Male, mid-40s, motor vehicle accident," Maggie said, snapping a pair of blue nitrile gloves over her hands. The latex snapped against her wrists with a sharp thwack. "Blunt force trauma to the chest." Paramedics reported a dropping BP and labored breathing. The double doors smashed open. The paramedics wheeled the gurney in, shouting vitals over the clatter of metal wheels. The patient was a pale, sweating mass of agony, his chest heaving irregularly. Maggie moved on instinct. Muscle memory took over. It was the same cold, calculated focus she had relied on years ago, in places much hotter and much louder than Oak Ridge Memorial. She grabbed the trauma shears and cut away the man's shredded flannel shirt. "All right, let's get a central line in, push 2 milligrams of morphine, and get him up to CT," Pendleton ordered smoothly, stepping back to avoid getting any fluids on his loafers. Maggie glanced at the monitor. The oxygen saturation was plummeting. The rhythm on the ECG was erratic, bounding with a dangerous, fluttering tachycardia. She looked at the patient's neck. The jugular veins were bulging, thick blue cords pressing against the skin. "Doctor, his trachea is deviating," Maggie said, her voice tight. "No breath sounds on the right side. It's a tension pneumothorax." "I see the chart, nurse," Pendleton said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's stick to the protocol. Central line, CT scan. We need imaging before we go poking holes." "He doesn't have time for a scan," Maggie said. Her hands were already moving toward the crash cart. "His lung is collapsing. It's compressing his heart. If we move him, he'll code in the elevator." Pendleton's jaw tightened. "I gave you a direct order, Nurse Flynn. Do not touch that cart." The monitor began to shriek. The patient's eyes rolled back. The frantic, wet gasping stopped. Maggie didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences of insubordination against her impending rent payment. She saw a man dying, and her body reacted. She ripped open a sterile package, pulling out a 14-gauge needle. "What the hell are you doing?" Pendleton yelled, finally stepping forward, his pristine composure cracking. Maggie ignored him. She found the second intercostal space, right at the mid-clavicular line, and drove the needle into the patient's chest. There was a sickening pop as the needle pierced the pleural space, followed immediately by a sharp hiss of escaping air. The shrieking monitor instantly changed its tune. The jagged, terrifying lines on the screen smoothed out. The patient took a deep, shuddering gasp, his color slowly beginning to return from a terrifying shade of gray. The trauma bay fell dead silent, save for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking slightly. She stepped back, dropping the empty plastic casing of the needle into the red biohazard bin. She turned to look at Pendleton. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. It wasn't the relief of a doctor whose patient had just been saved. It was the fury of an autocrat who had just been publicly defied. The attending residents and the respiratory therapist were staring at the floor, suddenly finding the linoleum intensely interesting. "My office," Pendleton whispered. His voice was dangerously soft. "Now." 10 minutes later, Maggie stood in Pendleton's office. The room was aggressively sterile, filled with modern, uncomfortable furniture and framed degrees that took up half the walls. "You are a nurse," Pendleton said, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. He didn't offer her a chair. "You are not a diagnostician. You are not a surgeon. You are here to execute my orders." "Your order would have killed him," Maggie said. Her voice was raspy. She hated how defensive she sounded. She wanted to sound strong, righteous. Instead, she just sounded tired. "My order was based on a complete medical assessment, not the panicked cowboy antics of a glorified bedpan cleaner," Pendleton spat. He stood up, leaning over the desk. "You bypassed protocol. You assaulted a patient with an invasive procedure without physician authorization. It's a massive liability. It's a saved life." "It is a termination," Pendleton corrected coldly. Maggie froze. The words hit her stomach like a lead weight. "What?" "You are fired, Miss Flynn. Effective immediately. Clear out your locker. I'll be notifying the nursing board of your gross negligence and insubordination. You'll be lucky if you ever find work in a clinic, let alone a hospital." Panic, hot and sour, flared in the back of her throat. She thought of the overdue electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought of her rusty sedan that desperately needed new brake pads. She wanted to yell at him, to slap the smug, vetiver-scented arrogance right off his face. But the fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, sickening shame. Her shoulders slumped. She didn't deliver a biting retort. She just swallowed hard, the lump in her throat feeling like swallowed glass. "Understood," she whispered. She turned and walked out, her squeaking shoes sounding pathetic against the quiet carpet of the administrative wing. The women's locker room was situated in the basement. It felt like a bunker, windowless and damp, smelling faintly of mildew and cheap body spray. Maggie stood in front of locker number 42. It had a dent right in the middle of the gray metal door, a flaw she used to trace with her finger when she was stressed. She spun the combination dial. Her hands were still trembling. The adrenaline from the trauma bay was crashing, leaving her nauseous and cold. When the door popped open, she just stared at the contents. A spare pair of socks, a half-eaten granola bar, a heavily underlined copy of a nursing pharmacology textbook. Taped to the inside of the door was a small, faded photograph. Maggie reached out and touched the photo. It showed a younger version of herself, face smeared with dirt and sweat, wearing desert camouflage. She was kneeling next to a dusty medical tent, a heavy canvas bag slung over her shoulder, grinning exhaustedly at the camera. She pulled the tape free, folding the picture carefully and sliding it into her pocket. Tears prickled the corners of her eyes. She wiped them away roughly, angry at herself. Don't cry in the basement, she thought. Don't give them the satisfaction. But it wasn't about them. It was the unfairness of it all. The crushing weight of trying to do the right thing and being punished for it. She grabbed a flattened cardboard box from the recycling bin in the corner and began tossing her things inside. While Maggie was weeping in the basement, the upper floors of Oak Ridge Memorial were spiraling into a completely different kind of chaos. The hospital administrator, a nervous man named David Carmichael, was sweating profusely through his expensive suit. He was power walking down the main lobby concourse, flanked by a frantic PR team and an equally flustered Dr. Pendleton. "They're 5 minutes away," Carmichael barked, checking his phone for the 4th time in a minute. "Are the VIP suites ready? Has the lobby been cleared?" "Everything is pristine," Pendleton assured him, adjusting his cuffs. He looked thrilled. This was the kind of medicine he loved, high-profile, high-stakes PR. "I've assigned my top surgical residents to be on standby. We are fully prepared to accommodate the general and his staff." General Thomas Hackett was a legend, a 4-star general, a decorated war hero, and currently the head of a massive Joint Forces medical initiative. He was in town inspecting veteran care facilities, and Oak Ridge Memorial was desperate for the federal grant money his initiative controlled. His unexpected detour to their hospital, ostensibly to visit a retired colonel who had been admitted for a bypass surgery, was an opportunity Carmichael was not going to waste. "Listen to me, Arthur," Carmichael said, stopping and pointing a trembling finger at the surgeon. "This man eats bureaucratic red tape for breakfast. He is old school. No screw-ups. We show him a well-oiled, disciplined, state-of-the-art facility. Understood? Impeccable discipline is my trademark." David Pendleton smiled smoothly. "I actually just had to terminate a rogue nurse this morning to maintain those exact standards. We tolerate zero liabilities." Carmichael nodded, barely listening. Through the massive glass doors of the lobby, 3 black SUVs with heavy tinted windows pulled up to the curb. The hospital security guards scrambled to open the doors. Down in the basement, Maggie folded the flaps of her cardboard box. The bottom was slightly damp from where it had been resting on the floor, and she held it awkwardly against her hip. She took off her ID badge, the one with the terrible photo where her eyes were half closed, and left it on the wooden bench. She didn't want to take the staff elevator. She didn't want to see the pitying looks of her colleagues, or worse, their averted eyes. She opted for the main stairwell, planning to slip out through the busy central lobby and disappear into the humid morning air. Maggie pushed open the heavy fire door leading into the main concourse. The box in her arms was heavy, the edge digging into her ribs. The lobby was unusually quiet. The normal hustle of patients and families had been pushed to the perimeter. In the center of the vast, sunlit atrium, a procession was moving inward. It was a phalanx of military personnel in sharp dress uniforms, moving with synchronized, intimidating purpose. At the center walked General Thomas Hackett. He was a tall man, barrel-chested, with iron-gray hair cropped close to his scalp. His face looked like it had been carved from weathered granite, deeply lined and expressionless. The ribbons on his chest were a vibrant mosaic of campaigns, conflicts, and shed blood. Flanking him like anxious remoras were Carmichael and Pendleton. "General, if you'll follow me, we have the executive elevator holding for you," Pendleton was saying, gesturing grandly toward the central bank. "We pride ourselves on efficiency here." Maggie froze near the edge of the concourse. She just wanted to cross to the sliding exit doors, but the entourage was blocking the path. She ducked her head, hoping to blend into the background. She was just a fired, exhausted woman holding a soggy cardboard box. She took a step backward, aiming for the shadow of a large potted ficus, but her rubber sole caught the edge of a wet floor sign someone had hastily shoved aside. Maggie stumbled. She tried to catch her balance, but the heavy pharmacology textbook in her box shifted. The cardboard ripped. With a loud, embarrassing clatter, the contents of her locker spilled across the polished marble floor. The textbook slammed down. The granola bar skittered away. A plastic stethoscope bounced toward the center of the room. The sound echoed through the cavernous lobby. Everyone stopped. Pendleton whipped his head around, his eyes narrowing in instant, furious recognition. Carmichael gasped as if someone had just thrown a grenade into his perfect morning. The military detail halted, hands instinctively dropping toward their waists before relaxing. Maggie stood frozen, her face burning with a heat so intense she thought her skin might peel off. The humiliation was absolute, physical, crushing. She dropped to her knees, her back protesting fiercely, and began frantically scooping her pathetic belongings back into her arms. "Security," Pendleton hissed, stepping forward, his face flushed with anger. He looked at a nearby guard. "Get this woman out of here immediately. She is trespassing." The guard jogged over, looking apologetic but firm. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." Maggie grabbed her book, clutching it to her chest. She didn't look up. She couldn't. "I'm going," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm going." General Hackett had stopped walking. His eyes, sharp and predatory, tracked the plastic stethoscope as it rolled to a stop near his highly polished dress shoes. He didn't look at Pendleton. He didn't look at Carmichael. He looked down at the kneeling woman with the messy hair and the oversized scrubs. He studied the slope of her shoulders, the way she braced her weight on one knee, a stance designed to compensate for a very specific, familiar kind of injury. "Hold on," General Hackett's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but it carried a gravelly authority that instantly silenced the entire atrium. Pendleton stepped in, forcing an obsequious smile. "Apologies, General," a former employee, disgruntled and unstable. "We had to let her go this morning due to severe protocol violations. Please, right this way." Hackett raised a single, scarred hand. Pendleton's mouth snapped shut. The general took a slow step forward. The heavy thud of his boots echoed off the marble. He stepped past the hospital administrator. He stepped past the chief of surgery. He stopped right in front of Maggie. Maggie stared at the toes of his boots. They were perfectly spit-shined. A single drop of sweat rolled down her nose and splashed onto the marble floor. "Leave the book, soldier," Hackett said softly. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, her head snapped up. General Hackett was staring down at her, his hard granite features softening into an expression that looked painfully like relief. He looked from her tired eyes down to her trembling hands, and then slowly back up to her face. The lobby was dead silent. Pendleton looked as if he was choking on a peach pit. "Get up," Hackett commanded gently. Maggie slowly rose to her feet, her bad knee popping audibly in the quiet room. She stood there, clutching her book, a stray strand of hair clinging to her damp cheek. General Thomas Hackett, commander of the Joint Medical Forces, veteran of 3 wars, stood at attention. His spine snapped perfectly straight. He brought his right hand up in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. "Sergeant First Class Flynn," the general said, his voice ringing out across the stunned lobby. "It's been a long time." For a long, agonizing second, the silence in the lobby was so absolute, Maggie could hear the hum of the vending machines down the hall. Her right arm gave a phantom twitch. It was an old reflex, buried under years of exhaustion and civilian paperwork, screaming at her to drop the damp cardboard box and return the salute. But her fingers just dug deeper into the torn, corrugated edge. She didn't feel like a sergeant. She felt like a tired, broke woman whose knee was on fire from hitting the marble floor. General Hackett held the salute for a full 3 seconds, forcing every doctor, executive, and armed guard in the room to witness it. Then, sharply, he snapped his hand down. The granite facade of his face cracked. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and did something that made the PR team collectively gasp. He reached out, ignoring the spilled granola bars and the cheap stethoscope, and pulled Maggie into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. He smelled of brass polish, leather, and strong black tea. It was a smell that violently dragged Maggie back to a dusty triage tent in Kandahar, to the deafening roar of mortar fire and the metallic tang of fresh blood. "I thought we lost you to the VA bureaucracy, Flynn," Hackett murmured, his voice gruff, meant only for her. "I just wanted a quiet life, sir," Maggie rasped against the rough wool of his uniform shoulder. "Turns out, I'm not very good at it." Hackett pulled back, keeping his heavy hands on her shoulders. His eyes, sharp as shattered glass, scanned her face. He took in the dark bags under her eyes, the faded, poorly fitting scrubs, the slight, involuntary grimace of pain she wore from her bad back. Then, his gaze drifted down to the cardboard box crushed against her hip. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by a terrifying, Arctic chill. He slowly turned his head to look at Pendleton. Dr. Arthur Pendleton had lost his perfect posture. His pristine white coat suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. He was staring at Hackett's hands on Maggie's shoulders, his brain visibly struggling to process the impossible mathematics of the situation. "Doctor," Hackett said. The word was not a title, it was a weapon. "You told me you terminated a rogue nurse this morning, a disgruntled employee." Pendleton swallowed hard. The sound was audible. "General, I was unaware of her military background, but the hospital's protocols are absolute. She acted completely outside her scope of practice." "Explain," Hackett demanded. He didn't yell. The terrifying thing about men who have commanded thousands in combat is that they never need to raise their voices to be menacing. "A trauma patient," Pendleton stammered, looking frantically at Carmichael for support. The administrator had physically shrunk back against the wall, sweating through his collar. "Blunt force trauma." Before imaging could be secured, she grabbed a 14-gauge needle and plunged it into the patient's chest. No physician authorization. It was a massive liability risk. Hackett slowly turned back to Maggie. "Tension pneumothorax?" Maggie nodded once, her throat tight. "Trachea was deviating, sir. Sats dropping fast. He was coding. He didn't have the 3 minutes it would take to get to the CT scanner. I decompressed the pleural space. Did he live? Hackett asked. Yes, sir. Vitals stabilized immediately. Hackett let out a slow, hissing breath through his teeth. He let go of Maggie and took slow, deliberate steps toward the chief of surgery. Pendleton tried to hold his ground, but his expensive loafers shuffled backward a fraction of an inch against the polished floor. Dr. Pendleton, Hackett said, his voice dropping into a register that rattled the glass of the nearby reception desk. Do you know where Sergeant Flynn learned how to perform a needle decompression? Pendleton shook his head mutely. She learned it in the Korengal Valley, in the dark. While enemy combatants were actively trying to put high-velocity rounds through the canvas of our medical tent, Hackett leaned in closer. The smell of his leather boots seemed to overpower Pendleton's expensive vetiver cologne. She didn't have a CT scanner. She didn't have a clean, brightly lit trauma bay. She had a flashlight gripped in her teeth and a dying 19-year-old kid bleeding out on a folding table. Pendleton's mouth opened, but only a dry squeak came out. That kid was my radio operator, Hackett continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which somehow made it infinitely worse. His chest was crushed by a mortar blast. Sergeant Flynn jammed a needle into his chest, breathed life back into his lungs, and kept him alive for 6 hours until the dust-off bird could land. She did it with blood soaking her boots and the air smelling like cordite and death. The lobby was paralyzed. Patients in wheelchairs had stopped moving. The security guards looked as though they wanted to salute. Hackett turned his gaze to the hospital administrator. Carmichael flinched as if he'd been struck. Mr. Carmichael, Hackett said smoothly, I came to Oak Ridge Memorial today to evaluate this facility for a $30 million federal trauma grant. I was told you ran a tight ship, that you prioritized patient outcomes above all else. We do, General, I assure you, Carmichael pleaded, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. You prioritize your liability, Hackett cut him off, pointing a thick, scarred finger at Pendleton. You let peacocks in dry-clean coats dictate who lives and who dies because they are terrified of paperwork. You fired a combat medic who possesses more trauma instinct in her fingernail than your chief of surgery has in his entire overeducated, risk-averse body. General Hackett, please. There are medical board regulations, Pendleton tried to interject, his ego making a last, desperate bid for survival. Hackett didn't even look at him. Your grant review is concluded, Carmichael. Do not contact my office again. Carmichael's face crumpled. He looked like a man watching his house burn down. Pendleton stood frozen, his perfect jaw slack, his career suddenly flashing before his eyes, not as a triumph, but as a long, sterile corridor leading to nowhere. Hackett turned his back on the executives and walked back to Maggie. She was still standing there, holding her ripped box. She didn't feel a rush of triumphant vindication. She just felt deeply, profoundly tired. Her back ached, her feet hurt, and the fluorescent lights were starting to give her a migraine. The theatrical justice of the moment was entirely lost on her exhausted nervous system. Sergeant, Hackett said quietly. I'm a civilian now, General, Maggie replied, her voice flat. She adjusted the heavy box. Just an unemployed one. Not anymore. Hackett reached out and gently took the heavy cardboard box from her arms. He handed it off to a bewildered two-star aide standing behind him, without breaking eye contact with Maggie. I'm standing up a new Joint Forces Trauma Training Center in Virginia. I need a chief instructor. I don't need someone who knows how to chart a billing code. I need someone who knows what to do when the protocol fails and the blood is pooling on the floor. Maggie stared at him. The offer hung in the cold, conditioned air of the lobby. Virginia, a training center. No more Dr. Pendletons. No more hiding her instincts under layers of bureaucratic red tape. A ghost of a smile, weary but genuine, finally tugged at the corner of her mouth. Do the boots have to be that shiny? Hackett let out a sudden, booming laugh. It broke the suffocating tension in the room, loud and full of genuine warmth. For you, Flynn, you can wear the squeaky rubber shoes. I don't give a damn. He offered his arm. Maggie didn't take it. She didn't need to be escorted like a fragile thing. She just fell into step beside him, her stride naturally matching the rhythmic, measured pace of the military men surrounding them. They walked out through the automatic glass doors, leaving the sterile, terrified silence of Oak Ridge Memorial behind them. Back in the lobby, The ripped cardboard box sat awkwardly in the arms of the military aide. But on the floor, left behind in the chaotic spill, lay Maggie's plastic employee badge. Doctor? Pendleton stared down at it, the terrible realization slowly sinking in that the woman whose career he thought he had ended had just annihilated his own without throwing a single punch. Did the arrogant doctor get what he deserved? Sometimes. Real heroes don't wear pristine white coats. They wear faded scrubs and the scars of experience. If Maggie's story of resilience and raw justice struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true worth cannot be hidden. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories of karma, courage, and the imperfect people who save our lives every day.